Welcome, everybody. I'm Jill Jonathan with Red, Wine, and Blue. We're a community of women who use digital media and friend-to-friend organizing to change the world one suburb at a time. And one way we do that is through conversation. So Joe is here to join me, and we are joined by Amanda Weinstein, our favorite economist. And a lot of you might know Amanda as one of our podcast hosts. So she co-hosts The Suburban Women Problem with Rachel Vinman and Jasmine Clark. A new episode just dropped this morning. It drops on Wednesday. Such a great podcast. Highly recommend it. And I also just want to do a little promo for the podcast because they will be doing their 100th episode on May 15th. And this is super cool because it's a virtual event. So this is something new. Heather Cox Richardson will be a special guest. If you don't know who she is, why not? You should know who Heather Cox Richardson is. She has an incredible daily newsletter to keep you up to date. So I cannot wait for this event. You can get tickets for it. They're $10. And it's just going to be a lot of fun. So just wanted to put that out there. The link is right there. Go redwine.blue, SWP 100. So welcome, Amanda.
Thank you. Thanks for talking about the podcast. We're excited about the 100th episode, and I'm excited to be here and talk about the economy, which we do sometimes on the podcast too.
Yes, which I always appreciate because
oh, good. Yeah, sometimes I get faces like, oh no.
I like it. And I will tell you, I went to business school, like I have a business degree, and I took an economics, like 1 or 2 classes, and they were not my best classes. I will tell you that. No. So yes. I am always here to learn, and you do such a good job of breaking it down and helping us understand what's going on.
Oh, well, thank you. I think it's a fun topic.
Yeah, I think so too. I think a lot of this stuff can be really intimidating. I mean, let's be honest, like how many of us really understand the nuances of, the economy and the debt ceiling, et cetera. And so sometimes it's like, I don't know. I don't want to admit what I don't know. But like, these are really important conversations to have, especially when it comes to this debt ceiling crisis and a maybe looming recession. Like these are the kinds of conversations that moms at my baseball games are actually having.
That's such a good point. And I think that is intentional. Like sometimes economists intentionally, and also I would say sometimes unintentionally, will talk in a way that eliminates people from feeling like they can ask the question or that, they're not smart enough to have an opinion. And that's just not true because our economy is made up of all of us. And so if we have an opinion, that's part of our economy. And so, having these conversations is actually really valuable to getting a check on, how our economy is doing.
Yeah. So we've had a conversation with you before on Instagram, and we talked about the debt ceiling. But what is the debt ceiling? Like, what is the way that you would describe it to somebody else? Because I remember that conversation. It was great. And I'm like, I think I need a refresher as well.
Me too.
Yeah. So the debt ceiling is made up. We made it up a while back. Most countries don't have it. I believe Denmark is the only other country that has this debt ceiling thing. So basically, the debt ceiling is a maximum that we put on ourselves of how much we're allowed to pay back. So when the government runs a deficit, when we spend more than we take in, then we run a deficit. And the debt is the accumulation of all of these deficits that we run every year. So the debt ceiling is a maximum that we say we are willing to pay back. So it's not a perfect example, but if you think about your credit card debt, right? So each month, if you spend more than you take in, right, then you have credit card debt. And this would be like you saying, look, I know on my credit card debt, I owe $3,000, but I'm just going to pay $2,000 back. And that's kind of what the debt ceiling is.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like when you boil it down that way, it makes complete and total sense. Right. But there's some question right now as to whether or not one of the parties in Congress wants to pay our bills, right? So this is what we're up against.
Yeah,
so pay our debt.
That's right. So largely what it tends to be Republicans use the debt ceiling as is they really just use it as a tool to get what they want. And so they basically say, look, our debt ceiling right now is at, 31.4 trillion, and we're not going to raise it unless you give us fill in the blank for what they want us to give them. And they use it as a way to reduce government spending on a lot of things for Americans.
What
Right.
kinds of things are they trying to reduce spending on?
Oh, so if you look at their bill, which is 320 pages, which I have not read at all, because
Why
I
not?
don't think
Why
most of them have read it all. But
Mhm.
generally, the gist is they don't want to do things like student loan forgiveness. So this is when we look at household debt. So households also take on debt, just like the government does. The second largest share of household debt is student loan debt, and this is something that they don't want to have student loan forgiveness. So they want to repeal green energy tax credits. So that actually means, as part of this deal, they want to raise our taxes. And they also want to kill the new IRS funding. And what that IRS funding does is it basically will help the IRS go raise money that people owe anyway, right? So we have, and it tends to be the wealthiest Americans, find ways around paying what they owe. And what this additional IRS funding can do is basically make sure that people are paying what they already owe. And getting rid of this actually could cost us $100 billion, or add $100 billion onto the deficit. So a lot of the things that they want are things that aren't going to help the deficit anyway, or would grow the deficit. Some shrink, but are we really, really willing to make that trade-off?
Yeah, and it seems like a lot of the proposals in their bill would actually hurt the most sort of the Americans in the most difficult positions, everyday Americans, and wouldn't touch the richest Americans, like the IRS cutting that spending there would sort of leave the richest Americans and
Would
corporations.
help them. Mhm.
Right. But in terms of some of the things, some of the people who would be hurt, going back to your, how this would impact students, that actually there's a 22% cut proposal here. It would gut funding for low-income students, reduce support for students with disabilities, slash mental health support for students, and make college more expensive. That's just one segment of the population. So they want to get rid of the student loan forgiveness, but it's so many more layers than that, where these students would feel the impact. But it's also impacting low-income families who are already food insecure, because some of the cuts would impact what we commonly call food stamps, which is now SNAP. So, and there's this idea that they have that they want to force people to go to work who are receiving some of these benefits. And these are people, like, they are really trying just to put food on the table. The money that they're getting from the government for SNAP isn't feeding their entire family, like luxury amounts of food. They're already struggling. So taking that away from them and forcing them to work would hurt them as well. And then, of course, there's this huge veterans component to it. They would be slashing the veterans' healthcare funding, that would undermine their access to telehealth. They're talking about cutting like tens of thousands of VA jobs, and the VA is already in bad shape as it is. It's like they're hurting the people already struggling the most and benefiting the richest and most well-off among us.
That's exactly right. So they are betting on us being really uncomfortable talking about things like food stamps, because we have put such stigma and shame around if you get food stamps. We have branded that a personal failure, so much so that 6-year-olds will refuse to get a free lunch at school because they don't want to put shame on their family. And they are betting that we can continue this shame, that if you happen to get a cancer diagnosis, we know a large share of American households are one bad thing away from being on food stamps. And we know take-up rates for food stamps are actually much lower than they should be. We know a lot of senior citizens who are eligible for food stamps never get them because of the shame that we put on these people. And they are betting that we are too afraid and too ashamed to talk about things like food stamps and helping Americans that need this through, oftentimes, most of the time, no fault of their own. But they're also betting on women like us not being able to talk about it. And they're betting that women like us are going to perpetuate that stigma onto 6-year-olds. And I think they're dead wrong here, because I think we can have these conversations, and we as women understand that our country really doesn't have much of a safety net. And instead, what we have is women. Women are the safety net. This is what we saw over COVID, is that when we don't have these programs like food stamps, who, by the way, America produces a whole bunch of food within our country. So this is also helpful for farmers, rural areas, the places that actually grow that food, have been big proponents of food stamp type programs, that we should be able to have this conversation and maintain, and we're the richest country in the world. No one in this country, especially no child in this country, should be going hungry. And we like to have this idea that we have this meritocracy, but the truth is when those SNAP benefits run out, those kids go to school hungry and they do worse on tests. They do worse on college entrance exams. They're less likely to go to college. They're more likely to be unemployed. We know that this has this kind of snowball effects. And we know, I know you ladies have probably heard me say it before, stingy pays twice. We are paying right now in our government budget for not addressing the issue sooner, for not making sure our kids are fed, for not making sure that we have an actual safety net so that when people have that one bad thing, they can bounce back to being productive members of society. We just don't have that right now. And Republicans want to completely take any net we have out from under us.
Yeah, I think it's so important that we have this conversation because they don't want us talking about it. They don't expect us to talk about it. But once we talk about it, once we do have these conversations, food insecurity is not a partisan issue. It doesn't care if you're a Republican, right? But it doesn't, if you're starving, it doesn't care what your political affiliation is. So this impacts people across the political spectrum. And somebody who is struggling might be like, wait a minute, hold on. But I thought they were just getting government spending under control. I thought this was to finally start paying our bills. I thought, and that's because that's the distraction, right? So the nuts and bolts of what they're doing, like these conversations are so important because this is what's getting lost, and people aren't really hearing what's going to be in this bill that might impact them negatively.
That's right. And I think we also miss, so when we talk about like what a deficit is, and we talk about, when you're spending more than you're taking in, right? So the other side of that equation is how much are you taking in? And we know that the wealthiest aren't paying their fair share, which is why we put that IRS funding in there. The Republicans don't want to talk about what they're taking in. They don't want to talk about making the wealthiest Americans pay their fair share. And we have an analysis by the White House where the top 400 Forbes 400 people, they pay less in taxes than many middle-class Americans, than a single teacher. That is just plain wrong. There is no reason that we should have the Forbes 400 paying less as a share in taxes than a teacher does. But we know that's happening in this country. And Republicans don't want us to have that conversation of just, can we tax people fairly? We're not taxing people fairly. And there are wealthy people who have the means to get out of paying taxes that they should be paying.
And it's so interesting because I've even heard friends say to me, well, I don't want my taxes increased. So it's like they have this message that the Republicans are actually not wanting to increase your taxes. Democrats want to increase your taxes. And I don't think what a lot of people understand is like what you're saying, like these millionaires and billionaires are getting out of paying their fair share. So if they paid their fair share, then that would solve a lot of problems. It
would solve a lot of problems. And this IRS funding is not even to raise taxes. It is to make sure people are paying what they already owe in taxes. But we also have the Republicans, part of the bill is actually raising taxes for green energy. Like they're also raising taxes. We also saw the Republicans take away the child tax credit, which was monumental for eliminating poverty and especially children in poverty. And they raised taxes on middle-class parents. I don't really know why. I can't get in their heads on that one. I thought they were for lower taxes, but that is not true. But we often we listen to their talking points instead of seeing what they're doing, right? I saw them raise taxes on middle-class Americans when they took away that child tax credit. I see them trying to raise taxes by taking away tax credits for renewable energy. I see them raising taxes. This is what they're doing. I don't care what their talking points are. I see what they're doing, and this is what they're doing.
And it's interesting because another obvious component here is that many of these same Republicans, Kevin McCarthy, have voted yes for these debt ceiling increases, right? Like they voted in the past with Donald Trump to do the very thing they're not
3 times, yes,
right. But now they're saying nope, no, we cannot. And so there's a political component to this, which is huge. And obviously, it's to be obstructive, but also to make a point, to be able to spin a narrative. But it's also chaotic, right? And And that kind of chaos is really damaging to democracy and to the institutions. Let's just say, in a hypothetical world, we defaulted, right? What are the ramifications of it? Because this is the game Republicans are currently playing. So what would happen to us if we default?
I mean, so if you could imagine, like, right, if a household just decides, I'm not paying my credit card bills anymore, right? We know for us, what happens is our credit score tanks if we want to buy a car, if we want to buy a house, that's out of the question, right? And it's a similar thing if the US does that. So if the US defaults and decides, you know what, we're just not going to pay back what we owe to people, right? This could completely crash our financial system because the government is much bigger than we are as one household, right? So we could have a back to Great Recession type financial crash if Congress decides to, and the Republicans decide to go through this and crash us. They could absolutely take our economy and crash it into the ground, which is what they're threatening.
Yeah. Sorry, Jill, go ahead.
Well, I'm just like, and it's what they're threatening. Like, what is the end game here? What are they trying to gain?
I mean, so to me, part of what they're doing is absolving themselves of personal responsibility. So when we look at the deficit and the debt that we do have, this is based on legislation, things that they have either voted on, that they have maybe voted against, but still spent in their districts, which many of them do with the Biden spending, is that they vote against it. And then they go back to their district and brag about all the money that they brought home. No, it's from Biden. And it completely ignores the fact that they're trying to undo what was already been voted on, right? We have already allocated these funds through legislation. This is how we're going to spend it. And there's no takesy backsies or whatever. There's no like mulligan on legislation. The mulligan is pass another bill, right? So if you want to fill in the blank, do it through legislation, right? Rather than kind of acting like grown-up legislators by doing it through legislation, because they probably can't get it passed when they don't have the presidency and they don't have the votes in both houses, right? They're going to try and do this through political stunts.
Yeah,
And
so
go ahead.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I just wanted to touch on that real quick because they are trying to undo legislation that they couldn't pass because they didn't have the House and they didn't have the Senate, in particular the PACT Act. So much money was spent or allocated in the PACT Act, which is for our vets, right? I believe it. Yeah. So, and they're trying to basically say, I'm sorry, that act that you passed that benefits our veterans, the people who signed up to serve us and, deserve us repaying with respect and consideration and healthcare, we're going to undo that. Like you said, takesy backsies on this legislation that we didn't approve because we weren't in power. And it's literally like trying to undo the power that you didn't have, to usurp it. Like if every single new Congress majority came in and tried to do that, nothing would get done, but it would sow so much chaos. So I just think it's crazy that is essentially what they're trying to do. They're trying to take the spending that was allocated and say through legislation and say, sorry, we weren't in charge then, we're in charge now, so no.
That's exactly right. So it's also ignoring things like the VA has a mandate, and the VA's mandate is to take care of veterans and their families. Like an unfunded mandate is basically taking away a mandate that is already in place, right? So if you would like to take away that mandate for the VA to take care of veterans, then let's see you try and take away that mandate. But the truth is the VA has a mandate. We have to take care of our veterans. And this is really, really important. We know that our veterans sign up to give their lives in defense of this nation, in defense of this country, upon the promise that we're going to take care of you and your family should something happen, right? We cannot take back that promise that we have made to veterans for a century because the Republicans feel like it. I don't know why they would. I really don't. I can't get in their heads on that one either.
And I don't want to.
No, I don't want to either.
I just don't want to. And Amanda, I'm just curious, like, what are your thoughts of the debt ceiling? Do you think it's something that we should absolve and just not have? Do you think it's something that should be increased? Or what do you think?
It should be gone. It's a made up thing that we made up. I think it was after World War I because we were upset of how much money, war costs. It should be gone. No other country has it. It's a political stunt. It's not effective. We raise it when we like the president. We threaten to not raise it when we don't like the president. It's all just based on the feelings of Republicans at that time period. And we should base, legislation and government policy on real debate, not based on, your feelings and how they go and these political stunts. It sows chaos, as you said, and that's part of their goal. They wanted to sow chaos so that we have mistrust in government. But But the truth is, when we have these conversations, I have mistrust in the Republican Party. And that's where my mistrust is, right? I don't think their intentions are good here. I don't think that they, can pass legislation the way that you're supposed to pass legislation in Congress. So they resort to political stunts. We shouldn't have something built in our system that allows for these political stunts, particularly that the political stunt is I'm going to threaten to tank our economy, right? We should not have something in our government that says at any time you can threaten to tank our economy. That's not a great thing to have in our government.
Yeah, I just want to go back because it kind of ties everything from the top to this too. What you just said. So we love Heather Cox Richardson, and she's brilliant. And so her Substack newsletter today came out, and she talks about the issue of the debt ceiling, the debt clause in the 14th Amendment specifically, which I didn't know was a thing. But she essentially says in the fourth section of the 14th Amendment, it reads, "The validity of the public debt of the United States authorized by law, including debts incurred for payment of pensions and bounties for services in suppressing insurrection or rebellion, shall not be questioned." So she's basically like, she's laying out, this there shouldn't be something that they could use as a political tool. In fact, to the contrary, we need to pay our debts, no question. And the fact that we do have something like this whole thing that can be used as a political prop and pawn with the danger of tanking our economy and impacting every single American and our standing worldwide, it should be done away with. It's ridiculous.
It should be done away with. And the truth is we like to say, well, households have to live within their means, right? So this is often what we hear from the Republicans, right? The government is spending more than they're making. They're not living within their means, right? But the truth is on average, households hold over 100,000 in debt. So the truth is households don't live within their means either. So what is that debt? The vast majority of household debt is our mortgage. It's what I'm sitting in right now. It's my house, right? Is it because households are fiscally irresponsible, right? Should we stop allowing households to buy houses, right? No, we have made an investment and we have said, I will pay that investment over time because this investment is worth it to me, right? This is also what government does, is we make investments in our future saying that we will pay that investment back over time. Right? That is hands down what our government should be doing. We should be making investments in our children, in the future of this country. We should be making investments in our veterans, guaranteeing, the investments that they've already put into our country. Governments need to invest and then pay that back over time, the same way households invest in a house and pay down that house over time.
That's such a great way of explaining it. I'm like, okay, that I understand. And how would we even go about of getting rid of the debt ceiling? How could that even be a possibility?
Oh, my understanding is it would have to be legislation. So I think that would have to be Congress and Senate saying, we're done with this debt ceiling. Like, let's be done, which they should do.
Yeah. I have another question because we kind of touched on it a little bit, because it's another thing that keeps coming up at like my son's baseball games, where a lot of the moms are talking about this looming recession. So I've many questions that I'm not ashamed to admit. I know what a recession means technically. I mean, I know it's a big, scary word. I know it's not good. I know I don't want to ever have one. What is it? What does that mean exactly for the economy? And B, is it looming? Are we heading towards one, in your opinion?
Yeah. So around December, they surveyed economists, and about half of economists said maybe by, I think, the third quarter that we would have a mild recession. So now I think it has ticked up to just above over half of economists saying it will. So a recession is defined by, so the NBER, the National Bureau of Economic Research, will actually define it for us when we're in a recession or not. And it's based on a number of different indicators like GDP. So what we look at is there's no kind of one, definitive. They look at a range of things that are going on in the economy, because our economy is complicated. So when we look at is a recession coming, we're looking at things like the labor market. So the labor markets have been like hot, right? People have a hard time finding people. We have people back at work. They're having to offer higher wages just to get people back in. We have had a very hot labor market. Hot labor markets do not suggest a recession. So with the Fed hiking up interest rates, part of the goal is to cool the economy down here to get inflation down. What that also tends to do is get unemployment up. So what we have started to see is the labor market cool a bit. So there we've seen an uptick in some layoffs. Not huge, but we have seen an uptick. And so we've seen reports of, the tech sector starting to lay off people. So that gives us a little indicator that the labor market's starting to cool. But a big indicator, especially that I look at, so some economists might disagree, is consumer spending. So consumer spending is around 60 to 70% of our economy in general. And if we look at consumer spending is doing great right now. We are still out there spending. And so this is where I think women actually have a better idea of the economy than a lot of men in Wall Street. Don't tell them. They'll be very offended.
Yeah, they would be upset.
I know women do most of the purchasing in this country, right? We look at my household. You can't see much of it here. I do most of the purchasing,
you do.
right? Yes, you probably do most of the purchasing, right? We have a better hold of, are we stopping to buy things? Are friends stopping to buy things? Even when we, if we've gone to the airport, do we see people stopping to like travel and take those things? I have not seen that. I don't see so the data suggests this as well, that we're still spending money. We're still traveling. We're still going to concerts. We're still buying what we need to buy for our home. Car sales are actually doing great. We're still buying cars. We're still spending money. And that's a large share of the economy. And so that part doing great. So the Fed will probably raise interest rates again. So it could be we go into mild recession if we all stop spending money, right? If we all start worrying, if more of us lose jobs, then that means less of us are going to spend, money buying cars and buying those other things. But when we generally see people living their lives and spending money, we're not going to see a recession. So that's really the big question. And part of the kind of unknown, I think, if you go back 100 years to the Spanish flu, right? So remember learning about like the Roaring 20s and the flappers, right? So what we don't often connect that to is before the Roaring 20s was the Spanish flu, right? So when you go through a year or two of watching people die and being stuck in your house, like when that's, over, or you view it as over, you want to leave your house and you want to go have fun and you want to enjoy the people that, really clearly, like life can be short, right? So if we have this Roaring 20s view now that we had after the Spanish flu, it's going to be real hard to see a recession come if we still want to enjoy our lives the way that we're enjoying it, if we're not spending money.
How much of honestly, still, how much of an impact did the COVID pandemic have on our economy? I mean, we're still obviously entrenched in dealing with it. Are we coming out of that? How would you say it's still impacting the economy today? Just based on what you were just saying.
Oh, huge. So I think sometimes people talk about like going back to normal. I don't think there's a going back, right? So even if we look at remote work, so we had remote work increasing before the pandemic just put it on steroids. That's a big effect on our economy, changing places and where people are going and where people can live, how people spend their money. Like even that, we're not going to go back. We might see some remote we're all at home remote right now, but we see the economy has made some kind of big changes that are going to be lasting. Remote work is a great example there. But also when we look at what happened over the pandemic is we had those kind of supply chain issues, right? So we had huge issue with getting products, whether it was toilet paper, you name it, right? So when we don't have enough of a supply, then that's going to drive prices up. And that's still what we're seeing today. So put on top of that, 2 years of being in our homes, where now we would like to, go be out with friends and we want to see the friends that we didn't get to see and make those memories and go to restaurants. So now you also have kind of some demand in there as well of saying, I don't want to be stuck in my house anymore, right? I want to go out, and we see households acting that way and spending. And I think we still see some of that kind of COVID-ness that we're going to see for a while.
Yeah. That's so interesting. Just the way you compared it to 100 years ago. I mean, and like tying it back to Heather Cox Richardson, that just made me think of like we were talking yesterday when we talked to Rachel about how she does such a great job explaining current events and how it ties back to what we've seen before. And you just did that as well. So
yeah, it's so important. And it's funny because there are these roadmaps, even though we didn't really have a roadmap for a pandemic, right? There are still these roadmaps that we can sort of look to guide us through decisions that come up now, or problems and issues that come up now. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, so even when we look at the pandemic, so leading up to the pandemic, before we had the shutdowns, so one thing that was interesting to track is if you looked at our restaurant spending. So our restaurant spending started to tank before a lot of shutdowns, right? So a lot of people, for example, blamed it, and the shutdowns were definitely part of it. Clearly we can't go spend money if we're in our house. However, what we saw is people were already stopping to spend in restaurants before the shutdown even went in place, right? So I love tracking consumer spending and how people are spending their money, because you start to see those things like, oh, we are not going to restaurants. This is going to be bad for restaurants. So where we spend our money is where we get jobs. So when we have like a very dynamic economy where we're spending money on the things that we want to spend our money on, and, businesses are out there providing the things that we want, whatever it is that, we decide that we want, we have this very dynamic economy, right? And right now we have that. Now, could it cool in, a quarter or two? It could, especially if the Fed continues to increase interest rates, which is part of their goal, is cooling the economy. And so when we look at the Fed, what they're doing is they really aren't planning to pull back and to reverse course until they see inflation down, which they probably are not going to see it at, the level they want this year. And if we look back, even, talking about history, so a lot of economists, I think, are shaped by when they kind of became economists. So I became an economist in the Great Recession, where I saw a lot of people lose their jobs, and I saw a jobless recovery, and I saw the effect that had on families. So for me, the mandate of the Fed of making sure we have, full employment is half their mandate, really important. So the other mandate of the Fed is keeping prices down, which they're still working on. So for those people in the Fed right now that are trying to get inflation down, they became economists in the 70s, and they don't want to go back to the 70s. So it's not just the bell bottoms. What they don't want to go back to is like the up and down we had in the 70s, up until Volcker basically said, I'm going to tamp down inflation, and we're going to just deal with really severe recessions until it's done. And that's really the Fed's mindset right now, that they're going to follow that Volcker model, and they're not going to be done until inflation is down, which we have economists on the other side saying, inflation is hard for families. But what else is hard for families? Not having a job. Yeah. And we don't want to see a jobless recovery like we saw, in the Great Recession and following that. What we want to see is the recovery that we've actually had now through a lot of government spending that the Republicans are trying to undo with the debt ceiling of, we can have a safety net. We actually did it over COVID. This is part of why we see a job full recovery. I don't think that's job full is a word, but a job full recovery, because we made sure to put safety nets in place over the pandemic that we've never had before. Things like the child tax credit that we talked about. And that's exactly what Republicans are trying to take away right now with the debt ceiling.
I just want to touch on the child tax credit personally, because this is something that resonates with me specifically. Like, I was a paraprofessional for autistic preschoolers at that time, and I was making, after taxes, $400 a week. And I had to feed my kids. And I was able to get one child tax credit. My ex-husband got the other. And that money literally put food on my table. It was the only way that I could really sustain my income. And I'm sure I'm not alone. There are a lot of single moms. There are a lot of dual income families. There are a lot of single dads. There are a lot of people who are in the same boat as me. And it was a lifeline. And also there's something psychologically that does when you know that the government has your back, and that they see you, that they care about you. And I think, to your point about investments in the future, these are the kinds of things that they build a strong, country overall. Obviously economically, but also just fundamentally, because like you said, my kids weren't having to deal with their days hungry. They were able to focus. They were able to concentrate. They didn't have shame. It raises them to be productive members of society, hopefully, God willing. But I mean, these are the things, the sort of intangibles that Republicans aren't really focused on and don't seem to care about at all.
That's exactly right. And you put that so well. So the goal is to have programs like the child tax credit, where we can truly lift people out of poverty. But when we put restraints on any of these programs, take away the child tax credit, when we limit food stamps, when we limit who gets it or how they can get food stamps, when we just make it hard to get food stamps, what we're doing is we're making it harder for people to get out of poverty, which means we will continue to spend money on poverty, and we will continue to spend money on poverty because we're not actually helping them lift out of poverty. Mm-hmm. But if we help people lift out of poverty, you don't have to spend the money on it anymore.
Right. Yeah, right. And then they go and get jobs.
Yes,
And they
exactly.
contribute to
Love how
society.
that works. Wow, that's amazing. So, Amanda, as we wrap up, is there, I mean, I know one way that we can help in this situation is by having these conversations. And, you do that with your podcast. Joe and I do that with conversations that we have. But is there anything else that we can do or share with our friends or any actions that we can take?
I mean, I think the biggest thing is for women is your opinion is valid, right? If you go and you see all of your friends still shopping, that ain't a recession, right? It just isn't. And that opinion is valuable. And you have a lot of, it tends to be men in specific places who are in their office buildings still, who are making predictions about the economy. And the truth is they're not like, to use the military term, they're not boots on the ground. Women are the boots on the ground of the economy. When you talk with other women and have conversations about the economy, that is a boots on the ground perspective that the people in office buildings predicting recessions or not don't have, right? And both can be valuable. Having the data, seeing where those indicators are going, but also the boots on the ground, what's happening, which is really women, are a big indicator of what's happening in our economy. And so when you see what's happening in the economy, when you know what you're doing, right, that is really important. And I think women all have more knowledge about the economy than a lot of people would like to give us credit for.
I think that is so important what you just said, because one of the difficulties we have is having these conversations, because if the narrative is coming out that like the economy is terrible, it's in terrible shape, inflation's all the, Biden's fault and Democrats' fault, and people say this sort of stuff like the price of everything is so high, and then we don't know how to have those conversations. Just like a lot of people don't know how to answer that back. They don't know what to say. And then to your point, like take a temperature of yourself, of your life, of your friends' lives, of what's going on in your community. Look around. You know better about what's really happening than what some pundit talking head tells you on the news.
100%. That is true with our economy. That is true with everything, right? When they talk about our schools and what's going on in our schools on Fox News, please, please.
Right.
I know what's going on in my school better than you do at Fox News, right?
Yes,
same with our
exactly.
economy. Same with just about everything I can think about.
Yeah.
I think that makes me feel empowered. Like hearing you say that. And I'm like, yeah, I do know. Like I do most of the spending in my household. You're right. I do have a good idea of what's happening. So yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, and if Republicans really wanted to do something about the price of eggs and milk and gas, they would have plans for those things.
Let's do it. There's no plans. Yes, and I will say, and women are capable of understanding a lot of complicated stuff. We know that we're out there and we see what's going on in the economy. We also know inflation sucks. Why? Because we see it in our grocery bill, right? We see it happening. We know it. And if you look back to when we had really high inflation, again, back in the 70s, it was actually women that started saying like, hey, this is concerning for us, because they're the ones that noticed it first. Women were actually the ones that noticed things like inflation first, because they're the ones that tend to be the ones seeing it in the bills that they're paying for all of this stuff. Like women are capable of having these conversations about inflation sucks. This is really hard on my budget. But I also know tanking the economy ain't going to help. So let's not do that.
Right.
Yeah. Oh,
Exactly.
I so appreciate that. Joe, is there anything else that?
No, I just wanted to ask, I know we're over and we don't have much time left, but Janet Yellen, Treasury Secretary Yellen, notified Congress on Monday that the U.S. could default on its debt as early as June 1st. So I know McCarthy, when he gets back from his trip abroad, he's going to the White House, but this is imminent, right? Like this is not some far, down the road, far-flung idea. This is imminent.
No, so we've actually surpassed the debt ceiling already, but because we have Janet Yellen at the helm there of the Treasury Secretary, she's doing things to kind of push off the full default till June. And she's basically like, there's only so much I can do with budgets here. By June, we will default if you don't handle this.
I'm like, wow. And we're in May already. So it is coming up. So we will be paying attention to that. And I'm sure, Amanda, you'll be talking about this on the podcast every week. So thank you again so much for everything that you do. Just wanted to remind everybody about that 100th episode on May 15th with Heather Cox Richardson. We hope to see you there. And definitely subscribe to the Suburban Women podcast or Suburban Women Problem podcast. And you can hear all of Amanda's brilliance every week. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, ladies.
Thank you,
Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.
You too.